Going on YouTube? Andrew Miller and Shane Black from hook'emheadlines.com. We're coming back at y'all today with more in-depth preview of the Sweet 16 matchup this Friday between the 2-seed Texas Longhorns and then the 3-seed Xavier Musketeers. Got you, Xavier fans. Heard the outcry from the first video. I guess I was saying Xavier a lot, but you know what? We'll make sure that we look out for that here moving forward. On a more serious note, though, I've had a few more days to digest this matchup and really think it through. Maybe coming off kind of a high from from at least making it to the Sweet 16, beating Penn State last weekend, and watching one or two more Xavier games. This game, I think, is going to be a close one. It's going to be a good matchup. It's the highest seeded team that Texas has faced so far in the NCAA tournament. One interesting question that I had was, how do you feel about matching up with Xavier versus Penn State or Colgate?
Yeah, so it's interesting. All three teams shoot the three ball really well. And we saw in the first two rounds, Texas was able to shut down Colgate and Penn State from deep, holding them to two of their worst outputs on the season. So when it comes to that stylistic matchup, I think advantage Longhorns. They just had two game plans centered around running teams off the three-point line. Xavier shoots the ball from deep at a 38.9% clip. That was third nationally this year. So obviously a lot of guys, they move the ball well on the outside, get a lot of open looks, and a lot of guys who are capable of taking and making shots. But like I said, Texas, having just had two game plans centered around running teams off the three-point line, is going to be good for them. I mean, you don't have to switch up the game plan too much. The difference in this one is Xavier does have a very capable big man, Jack Nunge, down low, a true 6'11", can move you out of the paint, and they can certainly run their offense through him as well. Where if you look at Penn State, really didn't run anything through any of their bigs and often didn't play with the true big man on the floor. Colgate was also a little bit undersized, but even some of their bigs that they did have, we saw them hurt Texas a little bit in that first round matchup. So I think Nunge could be a big X factor in this one, but looking at stylistically, I am glad that Xavier kind of mimics Penn State and Colgate, obviously just kind of a more equipped version of those two teams. That should lend its favor to Texas.
Yeah, I mean, Texas has faced some of the most efficient offensive teams in the country in the NCAA tournaments so far. You mentioned Xavier's three-point shooting. And I mentioned this in the early preview I did, but they don't really shoot the ball they don't really shoot the three ball at a high clip or at a high volume. It's just efficient. It kind of feels like Iowa State earlier this season when Gabe Kalsher, Caleb Grill, all those guys were, kind of hot from deep. But they just took their shots when they were available. It's just interesting because Xavier does run at a really fast pace. They like to move the ball around a lot. Usually with as many solid three-point shooters as they have, that usually lends itself to more three-point attempts. So one thing to watch for me will be the fact that they have taken more three-point attempts in the NCAA tournament. I think they're just above. I'm going to check to make sure, but I think they're just above 20 per game in the NCAA tournament. Okay, they took 12 against Kennesaw State and then 24 against Pitt. So inconsistent trend so far.
I think that's the mark. Scandal aside at Arizona, I'm a big Sean Miller fan, and I think that's the mark of a good coach. He's gotten his team to buy in. And if the three-point shot is there, they're going to take it, but they're not going to force anything. So that's a team that you can look up, and just because they're hitting shots from deep doesn't mean they're going to keep forcing it. They shoot the seventh most. They had the seventh most attempts this season from two-point range. You look at these guards, Colby Jones, Sule Boom. They're really adept at getting into the lane. Solid slashers, good with the ball in their hands. I mentioned Nunge. This team isn't going to beat itself in that sense. They're not just going to start chucking threes because they're down 10 points or because it's working for them. They are going to work the game. As I've heard Rodney Terry say a lot over the past couple of weeks, work the game for 40 minutes. Xavier is a team that also works the game for 40 minutes. And that is a little concerning because while they're obviously basketball is a game of runs, the Musketeers level isn't going to dip very significantly throughout those 40 minutes. So I think Texas is going to have to play really well to hold serve with Xavier on Friday night.
Without a doubt, because one game that it's interesting you mentioned this because I actually had the thought today of one game that I'm actually kind of glad that happened for Texas at this point was that just defensive meltdown that they had against Kansas State earlier this year, because Xavier is capable of putting up 100 if you don't come to play on defense. They've done it already this season, I think, against Georgetown. And so I think for Texas, already kind of going through that experience and kind of seeing what it's like to just have bucket after bucket after bucket go in on you, I think is a valuable lesson learned for a game like this. Xavier scores about 81, 82 points per game. They run at an extremely fast pace, I think 36th in the country this season. And you mentioned a few different guys here. Nunji is a guy that can space you out. He can shoot the three ball really well for being a 7-footer. He can also score near the basket. Colby Jones, same deal, but he's more like a 6'6" wing. And then, Solely Boom, same thing. I think Boom takes a higher percentage of his shots from deep, but another guy that can be a slasher as well. Jones and Boom also can get a lot of buckets in transition. Xavier isn't a team that is like a high flying, we're going to try to get 30% of our points in transition team or driving the lane like TCU. But I think, I think it's just another game where, like you mentioned, Rodney Terry saying, you got to play a full 40 and you got to know that they're going to try to throw the kitchen sink at you, throw everything at you and more. It's cliche. I always throw something cliche in there.
Yeah, I mean, from what I've seen, they're really good at picking their spots. Like Nunji is, when he gets the ball, he turns and looks, and he's willing to push the pace with the pass up the court. And then, like you mentioned, Boom and Colby Jones are very adept in transition, getting to the rim and finishing. That is something that I think should concern Texas. Transition defense might be an issue. I don't know how aggressive they are going to be on the offensive glass because of that. Nunji's such a good rebounder. And in general, I don't think Xavier gave up a ton of offensive boards this year. So if I'm Rodney Terry, I'm kind of sending 3 or 4 back and letting, see if Dylan Dessou or Christian Bishop can maybe get a couple. But I think you really want to limit the easy baskets for Xavier and kind of force them into the half court. I mean, when you look at an offensive team that's as efficient as the Musketeers, it's going to be hard to limit them. I mean, they only scored under 70 points 7 times this year, 6 or 7 times, which is damn impressive. So I think your best bet is to try to make them beat you in the half court down, every single time down the floor, because they will pick and choose their spots to run, and often when they do, it's going to be an easy 2 points or often lead to silly fouls. So that's kind of one of the early things I'm going to be watching for, how Texas and Coach Terry attack the offensive glass.
Yeah, it actually, you mentioned the offensive glass. Xavier, or is this, man, I really do say that more than I think I do. They do have a lot of guys that are solid rebounders, but I think they give up more offensive boards than you would think. About 10 per game, ranks outside of the top 100 in the country. Nunji ends up being a fairly switchable guy, and so occasionally that can limit what he does on the glass. And while he is a 7-footer, he's averaging around 1 block per game this season, so it's mostly just his length that comes into play. He's not like this elite rim protector by any means. And so for that reason, I mean, you can get some offensive boards. It's just going to be about effort. It's not necessarily going to be about the size advantage or even the athleticism advantage, because Xavier does have some good athletes. I do agree with you. If there's just so many little things that Texas is going to have to do well to be able to win this game. And offensive boards, getting as many possessions back as possible. If you can slow down the pace, if Texas's offense is playing well and putting the ball in the basket could be a key here as well. Because, I mean, I don't like the idea of Xavier and Texas getting into like a track meet.
Yeah, definitely
Kind of
not.
end up favoring Xavier. I do wonder, pace adjusted, what their win loss is when they end up playing below 60 possessions per game or below 70 possessions per game.
But
Um,
I don't know if you have the numbers in front of me, but
I'm done on my spiel though in terms of pace. I'm just taking a look here. In terms of the matchups for this game, though, I spent so much time in the preview just looking at Xavier, and not so much just like at Texas. I kind of rounded up the video with that. Like, what are from like Texas's perspective? What do you think the key matchups are?
yeah. So I mean, looking at it on paper, it's going to be a backcourt battle. Colby. I mean, if you look, so I think the three Xavier guards and the three Texas guards match it like it's a damn good three-headed matchup. Obviously, Serge Rice starts the game on the bench, but when it really matters, Tyrese Hunter, Marcus Carr, and Serge Rice are going to be the three guards out there for the Longhorns. And for Xavier, it's going to be Sule Boone, Colby Jones, and Adam Kunkel. And I think that's a phenomenal matchup. And Texas had the guard advantage in a lot of games this year in the Big 12. Maybe, Baylor was the one team that you give the advantage to, but I think this Musketeers backcourt is going to give Texas everything they can handle. I mean, they're bigger, they're longer. They're going to make it hard on the Longhorn guards to get in the lane, and Marcus Carr's always going to have a hand in his face when he goes for that patented step back jumper. So I'm looking at the backcourt matchup here, and while I don't think it's as black and white as whatever trio of guards scores more points, that team's going to win. I do think limiting turnovers and on the other side for the other backcourt into turnovers is going to be very crucial. I also think just finding that rhythm early. I mean, we've seen it throughout most of the year. Tyrese Hunter is the definition of a rhythm scorer. He's either hot or cold. Very rarely do you find somewhere in the middle there. And I think Marcus Carr, it's his time to have a big game. We saw Dylan Disu carry Texas the first two rounds, but Carr and his last year in college basketball, I think it's going to be important for him to get off to a good start, maybe get to the foul line early, try to generate some points there. But I do think Xavier is going to make it hard on these Texas guards, and that's not we saw a whole lot this year, even given the depth of the Big 12.
Yeah, I mean, there's not a ton of super lengthy guards in the Big 12. I mean, some of the better guards in the Big 12, if I'm looking around the conference, like DeJuan Harris, Marquise Noel, Adam Flagler, like some of these guys, like 6'3" and under pretty much across the board, if not under 6 foot. So you're right. I mean, this is going to be a kind of a new challenge. I think you can dig into the bag, though, and take out what Texas had in their wins over Creighton and Gonzaga, where, extremely well-timed doubles. Solid off-ball. I always mention off-ball defense because Texas has been so good lately in drawing timely turnovers and, turning those into points that, that's going to be a major key here. Texas, again, they don't have, I always hear announcers talking about the amount of length that Texas brings to the table, that they're a long team, and I just don't understand it. They're not.
Yeah. It's weird. It's weird that it is so weird. Like announcers at the beginning of these tournament games have been, it's the length and athleticism for Texas. It's like maybe in 2021 with that team that lost to Abilene Christian, that all about length and athleticism and didn't have as much skill. But this Longhorns team, if you're watching this and you're a Texas fan, like this team is more skill based than it is length and athleticism. I assume you're going to go on and say this, but look at the backcourt with Hunter and Carr. Not the biggest of guys.
I was also looking at like Christian Bishop and Timmy Allen. I mean,
yeah.
Christian Bishop is just the definition of an effort player, but I've seen him get rim stuffed quite a few times in the last 2 seasons. Timmy Allen, not a bad athlete by any means, but I haven't seen him dunk on a million guys. And I mean, Dylan Disu is really the only one that's got like a lot of length, really good verticality, things like that. So runs the floor really well, really fluid. But yeah, I mean, Anyway, yeah, I'll jump back to this really quick because these are two things that I do think are interesting. I'll transition here by talking about turnovers. You mentioned like really limiting untimely turnovers, costly mistakes. You got to avoid that because that opens up this entire rabbit hole against Xavier that can kill you. First off, Xavier, we mentioned it over and over again, they don't rely on the transition game. It's not like a critical component of their game plan, but they can beat you that way. They are undefeated this season when scoring more than seven. Actually, it might be one loss. Either way, it's undefeated or one loss in about a sample size of like 9 games when they score more than 17 points in transition this season. So it's just an added bonus for them. If you turn the ball over a lot, you're going to create a lot of transition opportunities for them. And then you're also going to have to play at a faster pace, which plays right into their hands to try to get back even. So yeah, I'm going to say limiting turnovers. I quoted a bunch of stats in the first video that I had written down. I'm just going to say it's important. If you want to go back and see some of the more nuanced stats, you can take a look back there. But yeah, limiting turnovers was very important, or will be a very important thing, because Kennesaw State did a really nice job limiting turnovers against Xavier in that game that I watched. And if not for like a dozen, maybe a 14-point comeback that Xavier had in the first round, Kennesaw State almost pulled off a really big upset there. It was 72-67. So I think they finished up with like 4 turnovers. They also did a nice job limiting Xavier's 3-ball. So good learning lesson there. I mentioned pace earlier. I would be interested to see when they're held, or when they have fewer than 70 possessions in a game. What does that look like from a win-loss perspective? They're actually 4-6 on the season in games where the pace is under 70 possessions. That includes some bad losses as well. Nearly a 20-point loss to Creighton, 22-point loss to Seton Hall. And so I would slow the pace down if you can. Like you said, set the tone. I'm not saying dribble the air out of the basketball, but find a happy medium here where you can start putting a little bit more pressure on Xavier. Make sure you're not making untimely mistakes, minimize the opportunity to make errors. So, yeah, I mean, sometimes stats leap off the page at you. I'm not just saying that if they played 65 possessions in this game, that Texas is automatically going to win. That's not the case, but it can definitely help you.
Yeah, no, I certainly agree there. I think if the game's played below 75 total points, like if you told me the winner of this game is going to score 74, 68, something like that, I'm going to give the edge to Texas just blindly. Also, like you said, you can't just put that in black and white. I think one maybe X factor that I'd like to point out, Jerome Hunter. So this season averaged less than 8 points, but in 2 NCAA tournament games, he's averaging 19. He's basically the only guy on this Xavier team or in their rotation that doesn't shoot the 3-ball. He's kind of strictly, from what I've seen, he plays high-low basketball pretty well with Nunji. He can catch the ball in the short corner or, at the elbow, turn, face the defense, and assess pretty well. And then he's very capable on the offensive boards, strong finisher. He's a relentless athlete. Seems like he's going to be the guy where it's like, oh, Hunter's gotten, 5 extra possessions created for the Musketeers because of his effort alone. But that effort turned into buckets in the first 2 rounds. And he put up 24 against Kennesaw State. You mentioned the deficit that the Musketeers were dealing with in that one. Hunter's energy was kind of a big reason that pushed them over the top. So he's going to be an X factor. He's kind of a tricky matchup because if Nunji's on the floor, Christian Bishop or Dylan DeSue is going to be on Nunji. And then Jerome Hunter stands at 6'7", about 215. That's a tough matchup. And Brock Cunningham can guard him in that sense. But if you look at the regular Texas 5, that means Timmy Allen's going to be on Hunter. And Timmy Allen's going to be giving up some size in that one. And I'd be interested to see if Xavier tried to run some offense through Hunter, even though he probably is, the 5th offensive threat on the floor for them. that's kind of a favorable matchup if he's going up against Timmy Allen. But I think he's a guy to watch out for because he's someone that his offensive skill doesn't jump off the tape, but you'll look up and he'll have 12 points, 7 rebounds, and a couple steals and blocks, and you're like, wow, this guy really affected the game. And looking at Xavier, we might get into this, or I'll just mention it now. The depth really isn't there throughout the tournament, and really since they lost Zach Fremantle, they've been running kind of a 6-man rotation. So those 6 guys you're going to see a lot. Jerome Hunter's a guy who's going to play 30-plus minutes, and I think he's a guy who could frustrate Texas with kind of his versatility and just his do-it-all attitude.
It's interesting. I noticed that Jerome Hunter had one good game in the tournament, but yeah, 19 a game. He did really pick up the pace with Solly Boom and Colby Jones both kind of being colder shooting from the field to start the NCAA tournament. They're both under 40% so far. Nungy's picked up the pace. He's scoring at a clip about 15 per game, which isn't super far off his season average, but yeah, I mean, defending the paint's going to be massive here. They really do get. I think they're like top 15 in the country in points in the paint per game this season. In that respect, they're a lot like TCU, where they like to use their length and size to get some high percentage buckets. I mean, that's not that different though from Sean Miller's Arizona teams. I mentioned that in the first preview video I did. I mean, that's pretty much been a staple of his teams for a while. This is a pretty crazy stat. They don't have any games this season with fewer than 24 points in the paint, and only three with fewer than 30, fewer than 32 actually. They get a lot done in the paint. Texas is going to have to defend that. I don't know any other way to put that. I don't need to keep quoting stats here, but that's there's certain areas of games where, contests can be won and lost. And I think points in the paint is going to be one of those. And then to hammer home the point I was making earlier about points off turnovers, because thinking about it, this is going to be critical. There's almost a dozen games this season where, actually more than a dozen games this season where Xavier's gotten at least 18 points off turnovers, and 14-1 on the season. So you can't let them get easy buckets. This is already a team that's incredibly efficient on the offensive end. We talked so much about their offense, but you can beat them on. I think they're not a very good defensive team. For all the length that they have, they use a lot of their resources and energy on the offensive end. From what I could see, they stay very committed to sticking with their matchups to a fault. And so, I could see Texas running a lot of ball screens, a lot of off-ball cutting from Timmy Allen will be important. Saw some nice cuts from him against Penn State. He's one of the best cutters in the Big 12, though, I think, at least among forwards. And, I mean, Marcus Carr, he's like Jekyll and Hyde when it comes to driving the paint and scoring from the mid-range. But this has got to be one of those games where he's really on from inside the arc. He's been pretty cold, really cold, shooting from deep in the last month and a half. But if he can provide us a spark in the, with some solid paint scoring and in the mid range, get into the bucket, hell, get into the free throw line to get some easy money there. I think that'll be important.
Yeah, I agree with that the latter part of that statement. Like I mentioned, Xavier is only really running a 6-man rotation. If you can somehow get some guys into foul trouble, Sean Miller might have to scramble pretty quickly. For the most part, it seems like they've avoided that issue. You look at it and you say they're only running a 6-man rotation. They have been doing that since the Fremantle injury. Teams should probably try and exploit that. Easier said than done. They're a veteran team. They don't commit a lot of silly fouls. Like, if guys get by them, they kind of just let them go. And they're like, well, okay, we'll make this up on the offensive end of the floor. But if Nungy somehow picks up 2 quick fouls in the first half, completely changes the game. If you can get a couple of their, guards picking up a couple quick fouls, you can attack them easier. So I think that would be a big thing to watch. Texas has the massive depth advantage. Texas goes 9 deep in the tournament, it's been cut a little bit with how many minutes guys like Terrio, Morris, and Brock Cunningham are playing. But for the most part, bench advantage, massive advantage to the Longhorns. And that'd be something that I'd like to see Texas come out and be really aggressive, attack the paint, see if they can get to the free throw line. It'll be good for the offense, and hopefully, if we get some Musketeers in foul trouble, that lends its hand to success down the road.
Yeah, I mean, that's going to be huge because, we've seen like Dylan Dessou and Christian Bishop getting in foul trouble pretty early when Texas is facing some lengthier big men. And so you're going to need that spark from the bench. And so, yeah, I mean, I'll leave it at that. The last thing I'll say in terms of attacking Xavier's defense, just getting them in foul trouble. One area that they've actually been a little prone to giving up easy points is from the corner. They've also fouled some shooters in the corners from three this season. I think, it's around 39% on the season that opponents are shooting on Xavier from the corners. Tyrese Hunter has been underratedly so good shooting from the corners from three this season. I would like to see him post up a little bit more there, especially with how much Marcus Carr's been handling the ball as the primary facilitator. Let Marcus Carr drive and dish it out. Tyrese Hunter is just an average shooter from above the break. Some he misses pretty badly, especially when he doesn't set his feet. And so the other guy, Serge Barry Rice, is a good shooter from the corners. He can be good from above the break too, but he's actually a little bit more efficient from the corners. Long story short, Xavier doesn't close out super well. Like I said, they stick with their matchups to a fault. And so sometimes when they get sucked in, you can dish it back out. You mentioned sometimes that inside-out basketball. That could be a way to get some points here. Also, like I said, sometimes they're really undisciplined on their closeouts, and maybe you can get a 4-point bucket or two.
Yeah, I noticed that too. I think the Serge Barry Rice pump fake. Two things. Sean Miller, like I said, really good. Him getting 4 days to prepare, 4 or 5 days to prepare for this matchup, not the best thing for Texas because I think he's going to come out with a rock solid game plan, which is going to include notes about Serge Barry Rice's pump fake. But once Rice hits a couple threes, that pump fake is going to work really well because you just mentioned it. Xavier, from what I've noticed, very undisciplined on closeouts. Guards go running by pretty, flat-footed on the attack of the arc. So I think that's somewhere where Texas can find an advantage, especially if they knock down some early threes, and then Xavier guards are pressing to get out there. But I think the one final point that I just want to make is if you're a Texas fan, and Xavier fans are going to know this, but if you're a Texas fan, you're kind of looking at their recent results. I mean, this is one of the hotter teams in the country. Obviously, every team to get to this point has to have 1-2 in a row. But to end the regular season, Xavier was 5-1, with that one loss being in the Big East championship game where they put up not even close, just by far a season low of 51 points. All I'll say is that's kind of more of an anomaly. If you were to watch that game, you could tell that the Musketeers were tired and kind of beaten up. I mentioned that they really don't have a ton of depth, and playing their third game in a row in Madison Square Garden did not lend them any favors. So that certainly won't be a factor in this Texas game after all the rest they've gotten this week. But I just wanted to make Longhorn fans aware of that. Don't expect Xavier to come out and put up 51 points just because they did that, 2 weeks ago against Marquette. That's certainly not going to happen. That was an anomaly in a game that, they were playing on the third night of a triple header. So other than that, this team's been rolling of late, and they do scare me offensively, but I'm excited. It's one of the better Sweet 16 matchups, and I think it's going to be a good game throughout.
Definitely. I mean, I think the last thing we want to do is try to take a Shaka Smart game plan into a Sweet 16 matchup. So
very, very valid point. That's a very valid point.
So, I think it's easy to overlook. Or I think I will say that like Marquette did some nice things in terms of like scoring from the mid range and keeping Xavier actually off their own glass. And so But I mean, those are some trends this season that you could take as a whole. Yeah, okay. So I did my prediction already. I forgot what it is. I think it was like it was Texas by 3, I do believe. I would have to go back and look to be sure, but I will reserve my prediction because again, I already did it in a different video and I don't think I've really had the needle move too much. I think my initial take on the matchup here is pretty much what I'm sticking to. I'll say this, the Ken Palm prediction is Texas winning 79-75. I'll give you all that. But what's your score prediction for the game?
Yeah, I think it's going to be really back and forth. It's obvious basketball is a game of runs. This game is going to be no different. Both teams have the ability to heat it up from outside, and I think there's going to be some major swings back and forth about kind of which team sustains that high level. And I'm going to continue riding with the Longhorns. I'm going to go Texas 80, Xavier 77. Hopefully, if it gets to a point where the Longhorns are looking to close it out, they can do that a little better in the final minute than what they did against Penn State. Marcus Carr, obviously, silly foul, missing some free throws. In the end, it all worked out. But hopefully, if it gets to that point, the Longhorns have been pretty solid at making their free throws late in the game, especially when the ball gets in number 10's hands. So let's try to do that. But I'm really excited for this matchup. Two really good, fundamentally sound teams, veteran teams that a lot of these guys, whatever team loses, aren't going to play another game in college basketball. That always adds to the stakes. And I think both teams are going to be very well prepared. So it's going to be a lot of clean basketball. And, that's the best basketball to watch.
Yeah, and I'll leave it on this. I hope that the Dylan Dessou Award of this game goes to Tyrese Hunter. I think Texas is going to have to find someone to be a primary source of scoring, and maybe we see that March version of Hunter that we've seen pop up at times this season, and we did with Iowa State last year. So, but anyway.